Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me here today. So for those that are not asleep yet, I'm going to talk about regulatory convergence, which is the topic of this panel. I really wanted to talk about three aspects that have already been touched upon by a number of speakers. Is that better? I wanted to first of all talk about the EU regulatory landscape, but really to identify the grey or untouched areas of the EU regulatory landscape, and therefore to identify clearly the room for manoeuvre of member states and of regulators in general. And therefore, the reason why there is so much room for manoeuvre to foster convergence comes from the EU regulatory framework. And then I wanted to take the case of two examples of mobile TV and HD TV and explain in a nutshell what regulators have done to foster the development of these new services. So first of all, if you take a step back, the EU regulatory framework is basically a package of two sets of legislation. There's the telecom package on one side and the content regulation on the other side, which is the new Audiovisual Media Services Directive and the Electronic Commerce Directive. The telecom package covers, everybody knows, network operators and providers of electronic communication services. The AVMS Directive regulates providers of audiovisual media services and providers of on-demand services. So that's the EU regulatory framework. Now, I see that there are two areas that are not really covered in each of these sets of legislation. The first one is the function of aggregating content. So if you take the case of an IPTV service provider, mobile TV operator, the one that just selects content, packages it, is not really an audiovisual media service provider, and he's also obviously an electronic communication service provider if he provides that service to customers, but he's something else as well. And that something else is quite often regulated quite strongly in the member states. The other function that's not really covered in the EU legislative framework is the retailing, so the selling of subscription of television subscription packages to end users. That is not really covered at the moment. Now the new the review of the electronic communications framework is in fact touching upon that area, but it's not yet in the EU regulation. So this is also an area where member states have got quite an important role to play. Then there's a sharp difference of approach between these two legislative frameworks at EU level. The content regulation, to simplify, the AVMS directive, is based on an internal market approach and is there to regulate content, to promote a minimum set of EU audiovisual policy objectives. The telecom package has got a very different approach. It's definitely not got an internal market approach. It's still very much focused on national markets. It's more of an economic regulation for the wholesale aspect. So there's very different objectives to each of these packages. The other sharp difference is obviously in the telecom package you've got a requirement for very strong national regulators that are independent, that abide by strict rules, that have got appeal procedures, that have got very detailed tasks assigned to them. Whereas, in contrast to this, the AVMS directive does not set up a formal requirement for independent national regulators still in its new version. There's a political signal, but you can't say there's a requirement. So obviously you've got, in some member states, you've got regulators for the audiovisual sectors. In some others, you don't even. You have the ministry that's responsible. And then, of course, that means that you've got a set of different regulators at national level. It's completely logical. And then you have convergent regulators in some of the more advanced member states. Another very big, sharp difference between the telecom package and the AVMS directive is that the telecom package sets up general authorization systems for electronic communication service providers. the AVMS directive doesn't say anything, but licensing is completely implicit because there's a strong control of the state over the content that's delivered. There's also a requirement in the Electronic Commerce Directive that there can't be a specific prior authorization for on-demand media services, but that could well change under the AVMS Directive. Possibly this could be it could be that that member states and national regulators will actually set up some sort of declaration system for providers of on-demand audiovisual media services. So another sharp difference. So then the power of the member states and of national regulators is immense. And these powers come from three factors. First of all, that in the content regulation, so the AVMS directive, it's a minimum harmonization approach. So obviously, member states can introduce more detailed legislation. They can also give lots of powers or not to national regulators that they may not need, in fact, to set up. So there's a lot of room for maneuver. There's untouched areas of EU law that I'm going to come back to. And there's the power of the national regulatory authorities, I'm talking about the telecom regulators, that are clearly defined in the Framework Directive, but as I said, not in the AVMS Directive, and that gives them quite quite wide mandates, and therefore they have a lot of room for manoeuvre. So I'm just going to touch upon some of the untouched areas. Now, you'll probably say, well, there's more, but I've just identified a few. And one of them is on licensing. I'm talking about the licenses required for broadcasters. This is not regulated, as I said, in the AVMS Directive, and there's a wide variety of systems that are in place at national level. And some of them, so you have to think of a television channel that wants to be licensed in its member state. Sometimes the license is specific to the platform on which the program will be available, and sometimes it's not. So, of course, in a conversion environment, that can be a difficulty. You may have to apply for more than one license, etc. The length of the license varies, the licensing authority can vary, and the conditions can vary as well. Another important untouched area of EU legislation is access to premium content. So the conditions under which television platform operators can access premium content. And there's a number of instruments that are possible. One of them is obviously competition law. You have quite a few cases at EU level, but also at national level. You can have legislation in some of the member states, and that's often a counterpart to must-carry obligation. If you have a must-carry obligation in some legislations, you have the broadcaster has got an obligation to offer his content. Then there's the power of the regulator that can be enormous, like in Ofcom at the moment is playing with the idea of imposing a wholesale must-offer obligation on Ofcom. And they've not done it yet, but that's just an example of the power of the regulator to try to intervene in this market of accessing premium content. Then, of course, there's the question of IPR licensing, how to get the required license.